right, folks. Look, it's the Rogue News Roundtable, and we have with us the most amazing group of guys that I've ever met in my entire life. We're talking about, of course, the incomparable Joaquin Phoenix. He's here live. The incomparable Joaquin Phoenix, live,
Flores.
in person, in studio, and I'm elated. You need to get a hold of Joaquin. You need to follow him over on his Telegram at The New Resistance. I will post the links in the description box. Join his Telegram. Joaquin, you probably have like 50,000 people in your Telegram already, and it's growing. You don't have to like cut it off or start like 3 different Telegram channels at once, man.
I have to split off Telegram. I'm capped at 30,000, and I don't know if I can start other ones or what. I got to check with legal counsel. But basically, it's like you can't be an influencer until I'm done with what I need to do, because they basically, it's arbitrary. But if you look like in the UK, you look at like court rulings, or in the US, they've landed at this number that like 30,000 is like the lowest criteria to be like a, like that they can call you an influencer. And what that means is that you're a public person. And what that means in turn is that like things like defamation work differently. So
sure,
it's
Gotcha, understood. So Joaquin Flores is here. We have Matthew Ehret himself, the Brain Trust, aka Fireblood. Matthew Ehret is here. That's gonna be your new name, man. Fireblood.
Because I drink too much coffee,
folks.
I'm gonna be Joaquin Phoenix, and he's gonna be Matt Fireblood, and I'm just gonna
be running
Rising Phoenix.
That's it. I'm gonna be the running gorilla. We have like a Native American podcast right here. With the name Fireblood Phoenix, running gorilla. The only one normal here is Alex Krainer. Alex, he's gonna join us in a few minutes. He's just handling some things. With that being said, folks, guys, what do you guys want to talk about? There's so many things going on. Joaquin, you've been putting on a clinic with what's happening in Ukraine, an absolute clinic. And it's like, I remember the whole thing that you did with when that whole Wagner, the so-called Wagner coup was happening. And you're like, no, that's not a coup. This is going to happen. It's going to be A, B, C, and D. And exactly as how you said it is exactly how it played out. I was just like, oh my God. And my buddy Nick, who's a friend of both of ours, he was like, hey, you need to, Algo Cowboy. He's like, oh, Joaquin's been talking about it. He's been hitting it on all the points. I mean, there's so much happening. So whatever you guys want to start with, Joaquin, I guess we'll start with you. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to have Alex come on, he's going to have great insights also with things that are happening in the Balkans right now, like with Serbia and Kosovo, but that's just like excrement that's just hit the fan, like another blow up of that. And then we've got like of course in Ukraine, the big thing happening now is, as we had been forecasting, that the pressure is mounting on Zelensky. Is he going to step down? Is he going to have an election? Is that a distraction? What does that mean? What does Russia want? Do they want Zelensky in? Do they want him out? Right? In other words, if they had a choice, what works out for them? Why is the U.S. kind of putting this pressure all of a sudden, like on issues about the SBU is running torture camps? Why are the Western media, mainstream media, why is the State Department talking about things like Zelensky should have elections, right? So it's very, very weird. I would say that is one of the most startling developments. And of course, like for folks who are interested in kind of some of the meta-political aspects of this, and this is like a subject that Matt also does tremendous research on, the occult history of some of these organizations, and Marina Abramovich, to kind of bring that up, has been just tapped by Zelensky to head up some effort regarding children and ensuring, the well-being of children and the things that they learn.
Yes, very important, because Marina, a barren witch, is really concerned about children. I don't know if you knew that.
Right. That's why she has so many children of her own, right? That's why she's dedicated her life to raising children, right?
Exactly.
So it's other people's children she's very happy to get involved with, though.
Yeah, very, very excited. Absolutely. It's insane.
That is just really disturbing. I mean, I don't even know exactly what her position is, but it's something to do with an ambassador in charge of safety of children in Ukraine. Like, what does that even entail, other than the obvious questions when a Satanist is charged with that sort of thing? Mind will go certain places.
Well, what is Putin charged with? What is the actual ICC charge against Putin?
Abuse
That's a
of
good question.
children for removing children
Oh,
from
Right. So this is projection. Their method is to project onto their opponent the thing that they're guilty of. Right? Like, why would you need to remove
wow.
children from a war zone? Right?
right.
From orphanages? Right? Why would you need to do that? Well, one reason is they could get bombed. Another reason is that you have a country like Ukraine, whose government and intelligence service have been involved in one of the highest rates of like child and human trafficking in the world.
Right.
And you have Clinton Foundation involvement in Ukraine around this as well. So, how you doing, Alex?
Hey guys, I had to change devices.
It's okay. You live in Monaco. You're fashionably late. It's allowed.
If your young children are in earshot, though, you just jumped into the part of the conversation where we're talking about Marina Abramovich's satanic influence over.
No, that's okay. That's okay, Matt. I tied them. I tied them and I put some tape on their mouth. So we're good.
Okay. Oh, that's good.
The Abramovich method, it works, you know.
Oh, we shouldn't laugh, but I mean, you have to laugh or cry, right? And I mean,
yeah, no, it's we're laughing in the face of the devil is what we're doing. But yeah. What the and then we were saying there's stuff popping off with like Serbia and Kosovo, and that Alex would have a good perspective on that.
Well, you know, it's I think it's just one of the potential crisis flashpoints that the people who are losing across the board are now trying hard to detonate. Because, you know, if you're this is like a gambler's ruin, you know. If you're losing everything now, you're ready to throw the kitchen sink at the problem. And any war will be good, you know. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kosovo, Serbia, you know, you name it. Pakistan, India, Kashmir, anything just to worsen the crisis. I think that, you know, if you observe what's happening and you realize that they lost in Ukraine, I mean, they lost, period, in Ukraine. There's no hope of reversing this. And they keep escalating. They keep doing these stupid, silly gestures that will only worsen things, and they will not change the outcome of war. You know, if you were constructive, you would at some point sit down and think like, we got to cut our losses. We got to sit down at the table and negotiate the best peace deal. We have to negotiate the best possible peace deal that we can get. Instead, it seems that everything they're doing is worsening the situation. And there's only one explanation for this, because, okay, so one explanation could be that they're stupid, which is plausible, which is probable even. But the other, I think, more likely explanation is that they are absolutely desperate and are trying to do everything possible to provoke a bigger war, a wider war, to try to get NATO nations to close ranks and to maybe try to mobilize some kind of a collective West whole of society push into this war. And this would be, you know, the ideal way for them to deal with the crisis at home and to blame everything on the external enemy, you know, because, you know, either the markets are going to crash, or we're going into a deflationary death spiral, or we're going into an accelerated inflation. Nothing good is on the horizon, and they're responsible for it. They made it. They own it. So, you know, a big war against Russia or China, or preferably both, regardless of the fact that we're going to be defeated, would be a good way to sweep all that under the carpet, to cover everything with the flag of patriotism, and to say we're fighting for the good thing and the people, our enemies are the evil ones and they are to blame for all of our problems and we have to defeat them, and then shove as many men as possible into the meat grinder, get rid of the population, persuade everybody to start eating crickets and cockroaches, and usher in the new normal, build back better, and all of those things. So I think that's the war is actually on domestic populations, not on Russia so much or China.
Right. I agree with that. I mean, when you look at the golden billion, as Joseph Borrell would like to call the West, the golden billion. The golden billion's not doing so well. They're all broke. They're all insolvent. Their economies are hollowed out. They have no industry. I mean, my God. I mean, NATO has depleted itself from any sort of munitions that they have trying to fight the Russians, because you can't fight a real industrial power. And I agree with you, Alex. When I sit down with my hedge fund guys, I sit around with guys who are, running hedge funds, private equity, this, that, and the other. Going into 2025, none of us, and this is the scary thought, none of us have any sort of data metric. We don't even know. We know 2024 is going to be a hell of a year. 2025 is a great unknown for all of us, man. It's kind of scary.
Yeah.
Where the real population, they just said that we've crossed the 8 billion mark. And it's an interesting concept to think about population because of the different processes that drive population recording. At the local level of a county registrar, of a hospital, at the municipal level, then to the province or the state, and then only then, like if there's some national accounting, often those are like averages, they're based upon modeling and not necessarily like a head count, right? So if local governments or even hospitals starting at that level have some kind of impetus where they receive money to record births based upon population, then it can have some kind of distorting effect on what the real population number is. But I would expect it's distorting it upwards somewhere. And I don't know if that's 5%, 20%. I mean, I don't have a metric to know, but I would entertain the possibility that we could have, 7 billion, 5 billion, 4 billion. I don't know. But because there's so much of an impetus, even developing countries in Africa, which they say has over a billion people in the continent, but developing countries in Africa have a strong impetus to report population growth because they get per capita, funds for human development, for fighting poverty and things like this, and yet there's another thing that's also pushing this narrative of population, because so much of what they're talking about with the carbon footprint, kind of building on what Alex is saying with resetism and Build Back Better, that they're almost making the case for that population should be reduced. I mean, they're saying that people are the carbon, and they're saying, well, and we're making we're the carbon in the carbon equation, and they're saying, reduce the carbon. And Alex is pointing out quite rightly how these conflicts can be used to do and I hate to use the word of culling of a type, but yeah, it's very interesting. When I look
Joaquin, that's the word they use. They use that word between themselves. I know secondhand stories where some of these people between themselves in these cocktail parties in New York, they talk about the great culling. It's gonna be time to cull the herd. That's what they say between themselves, and then they chuckle a little bit because it's up to them. And I entirely agree with you about the head counts. I started doubting them at some point. I don't know when. I thought well, when they tell us that there's 7 billion people in the world, how do they really know? Who counted them? I didn't count them. I have no idea.
Right. And
so I think, what if there's only 5 billion of us, or 6? What if there's nothing near 8 billion? This obsession with overpopulation of the planet that they need to say because it's somehow their assignment. This obsession didn't start at 7 billion. It didn't start at 8 billion either. It started more than 100 years ago when we were less than a billion.
Yeah.
Okay. Hitler was obsessed with overpopulation and the need to reduce the population in the world. It's just that however many of us there are, it's too many for them. You know, they just like for us to go away.
Right.
And, you know, killing us is one way of making us go away. It would be better if they could hack us, take over our free will, and turn us into a different species, like, you know, worker termites that they have complete control over. That's how degenerate these people are, that they're actually, you know, working out these problems. You know, like they invented these problems, imagining them, and then they invent solutions. And you know, there's no line that they don't want to cross, and this is who we're up against. So you know, everything is up in the air. Nothing they tell us can be taken as truth, even remotely.
Well, on that issue too, like Thomas Malthus himself was already raving about the overpopulation crisis in 1799.
Yeah,
when he was foreseeing that by the turn of the 19th century, we would have upwards of potentially 1.5 billion people, and that would be unsupportable. So we have to act preventatively now in like 1802, you know, to try to mitigate the crisis in future population issues that would be the result of the fact that people reproduce geometrically, he says, and agriculture only reproduces or grows arithmetically. So you could foresee scientifically when that crisis was going to be. And of course, just like Yuval Harari and the current batch of neo-Malthusians, they make no account for the role of the resource that creates all resources, this immaterial but real existent thing called the human mind that can make discoveries. Because a mathematician can't weigh it, you know, you can't, if you're a British empiricist, you can't take the mind or a thought or an idea and cut it into pieces and dissect it and weigh it and you know, get all these different metrics you could put on charts. You can't do that. So they get very uncomfortable, and they just want to take what already exists in the material world, which ironically comes from the consequence of a whole ton of creative discoveries that they could not have made before they were born. But they're just like, okay, now it's ended. All of the current knowledge that we have scientifically and the resources that we call resources, instead of like, you know, what defines iron from being just a rock to being iron as an ore that you use. You know, at some point it was just a rock. So it required certain discoveries that humans made that changed its identity from a rock being something useful as a resource. And they're just like, okay, well, whatever we have now, that's all that can ever be. And they put like the end of history sort of stopgap. And they're like, okay, now it's just a matter of trying to control the scarcity, right? In some age where everybody plays by the same rules that we create. And if you break those rules, we got to kill you. But you know, those rules have no bearing on actual human nature. They're just projecting from their own bestial identities onto humanity, saying that's what humanity is. So we're all supposed to believe that, human beings are just these animals, viruses, even cancers that can just destroy, can't create. That's all we are. So you get little kids thinking maybe that's all we are.
Useless eaters. As Kissinger says, useless eaters we are.
Yeah, that's it. And it's like, no.
And there's, in fact, as you were speaking, Matt, it's and reflecting on what Alex was saying, I recall, and I think everyone has seen this by now, that clip of one of the representatives of the Club of Rome, speaking about overpopulation. And I think he said words to the effect of, well, if we get the population down to 2 billion, then it's sustainable. World population is sustainable, but people will live like in very cramped conditions and certain dietary regulations. But if we can get the population down to 1 billion, then maybe we can even like live all right. And this is like what has been open. This is not a conspiracy. This is a real organization. It's called the Club of Rome. And it's interesting that sometimes in trying to outreach or to do, work in public, people might think that these are fictional, or that there's lore around this, or that there's that this is a mythology or conspiracy theories. The Bilderberg Club, the Trilateral Commission, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, various NGOs or intergovernmental organizations, these different organizations that are part of the interlocking directorate. These are publicly registered. They're publicly known, and they have public spokespeople that make public statements. And among those statements is that world population should be down to 1 billion. And reflecting on what Alex and you're talking about, you mentioned Malthus in 1759. Was that it? Talking about
1799.
1799, forgive me, 1799, note to self. And looking at the conflicts in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Alex mentioned flare-ups in India, Pakistan, potentially even deeper, Kosovo, Serbia, or Bosnia, Serbia, etc. That these flashpoints, and I would also argue Europe, and Alex is absolutely right, and anyone who says it is right, that they don't really think that they can defeat Russia. But Europe is such a low-hanging fruit, and what I'm working on now is tracking the growth of European capital, whether it's intertwined or semi-independent from the American, like the first round of strong American takeover following World War II. To what extent, is the euro somewhat independent from the dollar? To what extent, maybe driven even by European industry as opposed to transatlantic finance? To what extent is European industry have needs to be connected to Russia, right, for energy that makes sense? Right now, Germany, compared to G7 countries, is paying 1.75% or 1.7 times what the median G7 country is paying for energy. How can Germany be competitive? It's supposed to be a very competitive economy, or at least very industrious and innovative. So how can you maintain this in light of this conflict with Russia? And it's clear to me, and Alex is right, and I know you've spoken to it too, Matt, that they don't think they can win this. But Europe is a very good low-hanging fruit for them. I mean, they can actually go in and try to re-seize any of this breakaway capital from European capital centers, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Joaquin, I don't really know what's there anymore. Because
in Europe,
we have a financial system that's an inverted pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
Which is based on very little real capital.
Yeah. Do you mean like industry, land, property, real estate capital, or?
Yes, not money.
Yeah,
And the money is a big speculative bubble, and the European banking, I think they're leveraged by about 30 times.
Yeah,
thereabouts. The American banks are a little bit less leveraged. European banks are leveraged about 30 times. That we know of. We don't know the effect of the loss of Ukraine and the loss of Africa, how that's going to worsen things, but it is going to worsen things considerably. And so it's a very, very collateral starved system. And it's not adding collateral, it's losing collateral.
100%.
But it desperately needs to grow, because this bond, the whole thing is a Ponzi scheme, and it's only stable so long as it grows.
Right.
And in order for it to grow in any kind of credible way, to retain the participants' confidence, it needs to keep adding collateral, but it's really struggling to do so. And so there's this real fear that at some point it all unravels very quickly. And their behavior is indicating that we're approaching that point, because they are themselves panicked. Their measures, their policies indicate that they are panicked. I'm convinced that in 2020, in March of 2020, with the pandemic, that the central bankers have staged a coup, that they have completely taken over economic and monetary policy. Now the governments are just talking heads. They don't even have any idea what to do. And so one thing that has happened is that suddenly all these imminent banking crises, like in 2015, 16, 19, we were talking about an imminent banking crisis. Deutsche Bank was going to fail any day. UBS was going to fail any day. Royal Bank of Scotland, whatever it's called today,
This was in October of 2019. August, September, October 2019.
September was September it started to become pretty obvious. We had a meeting at the
Jackson Hole,
where all the bankers were coming out in front of on the pressers, like looking gray and green and issuing very panic statements that something was broken. And then at that very same time started the big repo panic. And then event 201 and the pandemic. And then once the pandemic got going, the thing that kind of for me gave it away. Oh, hello, Martin.
Hello, Martin.
Hello, my friend.
Ah,
Glad I was able to make it.
Yes,
glad you're here.
Partially.
Excellent that you did. Welcome. So we were talking about the start of everything in the 2020, the Repogeddon, and then in the thing that to me is one of the important documents. It was the op-ed written by Mario Draghi in the Financial Times. I think that was 29 March, and I think that pretty much gave away that they've taken over. And then 3 days before that, the Federal Reserve did away with the reserve requirements for issuance of credit. So the reserve requirement went to zero, which means that there's no restriction on money creation anymore. They could just create money completely backed by nothing and put it into the circulation.
In Europe, or you just mean quantitative?
No, that's that's the Federal Reserve. I don't know if that's the case for Europe, but I think even if it isn't officially, probably unofficially it is. And so what the result is, we didn't have any banking failure, in spite of the fact that the pandemic radically worsened the economic conditions. And even before that, we were expecting an imminent banking collapse. So nothing happened. There's only one explanation: that the central banks are now backstopping all the bad debts on their books. They're buying bonds of the failing zombie corporations, and that tells you the end game. The end game is going to be a collapse of the currency, and I think that we can pretty much see that the first one to go will be the ones that started QE first, which is Bank of Japan and the Japanese yen, followed by ECB, followed by the euro, followed by Bank of England and the pound, and then I think the last one will be the dollar and the Federal Reserve System.
Yeah.
That follows the whole history of this crisis, starting around 97 with the Asian market crisis, and was at 97, and then interesting to try to follow the patterns of finance crisis, because you had the whatever they pumped into that. Then we had 2000, 2001, the dot-com bubble crisis.
Yep.
And then we move on to the 2007, 2008 bubble, too big to fail, housing market crisis, and the junk derivatives. And then at that time, Europe, I remember, it was the first very big change in a long time to ECB, or Euro creation regulation, where they began to purchase these so-called toxic derivatives. And they were wrapped up with assets that were clean, and they had to change the regulations to allow these to be purchased without that really verifying that they were sound. So then that takes us to what? We had 2008, but ever since they started doing the quantitative easing, they like never stopped really.
No.
Yeah.
So then we get to.
Well, then we get the longest and
crisis
biggest
after that.
everything bubble we ever had. Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
And they're all daisy chained. You know, Alex, you made a point of talking about how the Euro banks are about 30 times leveraged. Yeah, they're about 30 to almost 40 times leveraged, right? Now, we got to remember, ever since the Big Bang, what happened when the City of London got deregulated, one of the things that the City of London introduced to the world, the ultimate drug that they've introduced to the financial markets was what? Rehypothecation. In the UK, it is rehypothecated. Accounts are rehypothecated to infinity.
Yes,
Okay?
come look.
And Wall Street wanted to do the same thing. Wall Street is capped at about 120 times.
Yes.
Is your sound on?
Yes.
Martin, could you?
Yes.
Martin, we can hear you.
Martin's good.
Go ahead. First of all, in a way, I don't know why you wanted or needed me on here, because A, this is not my specialized area, and B, listening to Joaquin and Alex is always an education. It's not an education I want, because what they have to say is so terrifying and gloomy and documented. So the first contribution I make or can make is I agree, of course, with both of your brilliant and honest assessments, and I wish I did not, and I wish neither of you had to make them, because what you are saying is what ought to be it's to me, even at my elderly age, it is appalling and astonishing that the BBC and CBS and CNN and Fox too, of course, that none of them are reporting on this regularly every night. It is exactly what the public's, if democracy was real, if publics were being informed on the scale they need to be informed, if pressure was being brought to bear on representatives in the parliament and in the Congress, and that's the way democracy is supposed to work. Although these people are supposed to exercise their own judgment, they're supposed to be informed and to also respond to the fears of the people. And if the people are drugged, then they cannot pass on their fears to the representatives. So the whole system is broken down. But it starts with the media. And what you guys are all doing is trying to actually save the system and giving it a last second warning call. You are sounding the sirens. Yeah. You are sounding the sirens of crisis. I mean, what Alex and Joaquin have just pointed out is not just the coming global fiscal disaster, but where it is going to happen and the sequence in which it is going to happen, which is of crucial importance. And the only thing I have only two things I can offer to this. First, to agree and endorse with both your assessments. And I wish I didn't have to. You understand. I know you wish you didn't have to give them. But I completely support your assessments, and they are terrifying, and they are real. And I think a very key point, too, is going back to the Big Bang, which I remember as a very young guy, I was sent by the Washington Times to report on this at the time. And all anyone in any of the media in Britain and America could see was the good side of this. The good side of this. There was nobody wanted to see what it was. We should have seen was even then inevitably going to lead to. But of course, that was the fruit of the poisonous tree, as they say in American legal terminology. Unlimited, unregulated flow of finance and manipulation, starting in London and spreading out to other centers, leads, as my old teacher Isaiah Berlin said, what is freedom if it's only freedom for the big fish to eat the little fish? And that was the kind of freedom that has been spreading around the world since 1986. The unregulated freedom of the big fish to eat the little fish. Mm-hmm. Now, I only have one more point to say, though. And again, this is a direct consequence from your brilliant and remorseless analysis, Alex. And it is this. The yen is the first to go. And really, the yen has been propped up and staggering at death's door for reasons we all know, both global and internal to Japan, for 30 years now. But what will happen after the yen goes? I predict that in far quicker sequence than happened in the 1930s, democracy as we know it, which has been genuine in Japan for more than 70 years, will either disappear or completely reorient, that the Naruhito era will kick into full gear, and that Japan will follow South Africa in joining the BRICS. Japan will follow South Africa in joining the BRICS. The one final thought I'll add to this is something, again, that is thought crime in the United States. And that is that all our policies to destroy Russia economically and isolate Russia geopolitically over the past 9 years have backfired, as all of us around this table knew they would and warned in vain. And of course, we were not alone. There were many others saying it likely, but all of us, they tried to marginalize. But not only did they backfire, as a consequence of that backfire, it is the United States and Britain and the Western European allies who are isolated in the world. Saudi Arabia has joined with Iran, which was inconceivable, and now makes common cause in OPEC with Russia, which is unprecedented in practical terms. South Africa has now joined, has always been in the BRICS, but now it is joined Russia and China for military exercises. Yep. And that divides the world. That means that American sea power cannot operate freely in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean and be interchanged. They have to project it from Australia, and they cannot get round the Cape of Good Hope, because in any global conflict, China and Russia will be able to count on South Africa as a strategic ally as well as an economic ally. And that is enormous.
Yeah.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Yes, yes. Very good.
Gentlemen, what do you guys think about what's happening? I mean, one of the big highlight themes here is that as the empire collapses, they're getting desperate. They're trying to create shooting wars all over the place. They're trying to create as much havoc as possible, because for them, better to have a little bit of something than nothing at all.
Yes, I mean, it's, Alex and Martin just, Alex just said that he thought that the first next crisis in terms of where we might expect economic crisis to first rear its head would be Japan. And is that right?
Yes.
And Martin, you also said the same. And you're looking, and it's interesting because they, up until just a week ago, the present Japanese government in the cabinet had a few pro-Chinese people, and they've just had a rearrangement in their cabinet, and they've put in someone that is like more amenable to what the U.S. interests directly now are vis-a-vis Taiwan. So they've taken the pro-Chinese person out and put in someone who's had to step down from their hobby, where they have a paramilitary organization of United Japanese and Taiwanese. So now, but I think that even though this looks like a pivot away from China, bear in mind that this was actually just, and this is a not an anti-American government per se. They had pro-Chinese people in the cabinet, which means that that's what they wanted. And this little change right now is just a politicization to meet some, almost like in connection with the information war of the so-called Ukrainian counteroffensive. But I think, thinking about it broadly, it does come back to the fact that when you look at supply line security issues and you look at where Japan is and where reliable fuel is going to come from, and looking at the crisis that, and I don't mean to run interference here for Tojo or Hirohito, but when you look at the pinch that Japan was put into in the 30s and how they had to manage their energy in and outputs, they did not have a sovereign footing to do so. And they had to basically almost try to expand to avoid collapsing, almost like ancient Rome on hyperspeed. So I'm looking at leading up to 1930 to 1941. So I'm just trying to see, and I think that's all right. I think you guys have it exactly figured out. I'm going to have to take some notes. Forgive me.
Well, you have too the danger of the Straits of Malacca being disrupted as well. I know that that's a big point that the Chinese and many of those geopolitical planners who are thinking in terms of the multi.
Is it a technical difficulty for Matt?
Should we all test our audio?
Yeah, I think, is Matt there? Did he freeze?
I think Matt yes, on my
Yes,
screen.
it's Matt's connection. I muted myself and I'm talking like an idiot. I apologize.
I'm like, are we all frozen? No.
No,
Yeah,
I have the
it's
copyright on that V.
But real quick, we have a situation again, how they're trying to foment what's going on with Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Yeah.
We have all these conflicts happening all over the world. Alex Krainer, what's your take on with everything that's occurring right now as the West breaks? As right now they're trying to save face with the disaster that is Ukraine.
What's next?
Yeah, what's next?
Oh,
South China Seas.
I don't know. I think not. You know, I observed what's been going on in the South China Sea and with China, and I obviously, you know, it's very difficult to interpret. But you know, over the last 6 months, we had, you know, a Biden administration saber rattling. We had provocative visits to Taiwan. We had Antony Blinken going to Beijing and making a mess of it. And then we had Janet Yellen go there, and she stayed 4 days.
Yeah.
And it was a bit mysterious because we don't really know what she was there discussing about, but we did have a temporary reversal of Chinese dumping the U.S. treasuries, which is, I think, what she went there for.
Mm.
And then after her, when was it? Last month, Henry Kissinger went to Beijing, another head scratcher. And what, you know, it seems to me that the secret messaging is that we don't really want a war. We just need to tighten the screws at home, and we need an external enemy. So, you know, the politics is talking the ugly talk. They're trash talking you, but we don't really mean it. So don't get too alarmed about it. And then I think that, again, my conviction, because if you really wanted a war against China, you would probably be preparing for it. You wouldn't be hiring drag queens to be spokespersons for the Navy. You wouldn't be completely destroying your military's morale. I've spoken to people who have told me that they have multiple reports of American officers refusing up. How do you call it when you get a higher rank?
Yeah, promotions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, refusing promotions, and several people declined the rank of admiral. I tried to understand what that was about. I asked, and they told me, well, basically, you know, it's just, you know, responsibility and exposure, and for not much added value from a personal standpoint. But they said that the situation with politics and morale in the U.S. military is really, really alarming. It's really dismal. You wouldn't be doing this if you thought you were going to fight China. Also, you wouldn't be depleting your arsenal completely by sending all of your stuff over to Ukraine to be lost and destroyed by the Russians. So obviously they don't mean it. I think they needed to sweep under the carpet the domestic problems and to bamboozle the American people about the external enemy, to be able to deal with dissent quick and easy, to be able to, accuse their political opponents of lack of patriotism, of being traitors, of dealing with all of these ugly things, and to kind of consolidate the political situation at home. And so I think that this is the direction that they want to take. This is what, they want to kind of softly do away with free speech, with democracy, and usher in a totalitarianism. And for that, they need an external enemy. And I think that at this point, we're getting to the level of Orwell's 1984. The war doesn't even have to be real. You just have to kind of create the psychosis so that people think that the war is real and that the people are under this, constant state of emergency. Something terrible is going on and we have to accept all these new rules and eat bugs and forget free speech. And, anyway, so that's where I think we're going. But I think that in this respect, the American people have a lot of say in this. They don't have to passively acquiesce and let it all happen. Martin, I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Martin, before you say something, Alex made a point about about admirals, people not wanting to be admirals or being promoted to the rank of admiral. Alex, I want to clarify. There is a rank of admiral in the United States. It's very popular, and it is called the rear admiral. Like this gentleman here, he is a rear admiral because of the woke rainbow gay military that is in the United States. Rear admiral is the prominent position, so that's the new kind of admiral that we have here in the United States, the rear admiral. Yes. I want to share that. Go ahead, Martin.
Oh, no problem. Again, you've done it again, Alex. You always snooker me. You're right again. I mean, I have contribution to make, and it's that things are even worse than you say. Because the one area where I do not disagree with any of your analysis, that's a terrifying thing. It's brilliant, spot on. But I'm close to these people, and I've studied the history of the late 1930s, and it's even worse. They are doing exactly what you have said, but they are not competent about even that. They are confused about it. They do not want a war. They are terrified of a war, and yet they are making a war inevitable. And we have seen this before. It is very clear, and there was even no secret at the time, that President Franklin Roosevelt did want to provoke war with Nazi Germany after the fall of France. Not until then, but from that point to December 1941, certainly after he was re-elected, the orders out to the United States Navy in the Atlantic were deliberately escatory, shoot on sight U-boat German vessels in a time of peace between the United States and Nazi Germany. And the irony was, at that point, Hitler ordered his navy not to fight back, not because he was virtuous in any way. He was the most evil bastard that ever walked the earth. But he wasn't a totally suicidal fool. And he knew he could not harm the United States because he did not have a navy to do it. But once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and sank the Pacific Fleet, Hitler thought the Japanese will finish off the United States for me because they have a great naval power, the second in the world, which is about to become the first in the world, which fleetingly was the case. And he, of course, completely miscalculated the will of the American people and of President Roosevelt and of American productive capability, which buried them all. He completely missed that. It was his most fatal mistake, even bigger than invading Russia, because Russia could not have survived without the huge flood of food aid, especially in America and trucks that America sent it, and Russian leaders openly acknowledged this before the end of the war to Western leaders. But what you find is Dean Acheson, the same man who provoked through his incompetence the North Korean Soviet-backed invasion of South Korea in 1950, provoked Japan into war in 1941 because he was the man who pushed through bullishly the total oil and natural reserves embargo on Japan, which was the point where, exactly as you said, Alex, Japan had been feeling the squeeze for a decade from the United States, for 20 years, in fact, since America had forced Britain to scrap the Anglo-Japanese Naval Treaty in 1921. It was remorseless under both Republican and Democratic administrations. But the moment of no return for the Japanese, when Hirohito approved the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he personally approved it, to the Yamamoto Plan, was when Dean Acheson put the embargo on. But FDR misread this. He was looking on the embargo. He, like Churchill, like everybody else in the West, they were subconscious racists. They underestimated Japan and the Japanese. They did not think they were remotely capable of doing what they were doing. FDR wanted a war against Germany. He did not want a war against Japan. Dean Acheson's incompetence pushed America into the wrong war. And then Hitler bailed him out by adding to the incompetence, by declaring war in the United States, and when he didn't have to. We see something very similar, and you see the same thing with the Neville Chamberlain government in 1939. Did they want Nazi Germany to attack the Soviet Union? Yes, definitely. Did Chamberlain want peace in Europe? The rest of Europe? Yes, definitely. Chamberlain was convinced. He could recognize that Hitler was a gangster and a thug. He said so repeatedly. But he was convinced that Hitler respected him as a man. This was ludicrously, woefully wrong. He was an idiot. So was Lord Halifax. The fact that these people are idiots, and you make another key point. Could they be pushing through these insane policies, destroying the morale of the United States Navy and Army with these mad transgender policies? Could they be pushing them through if they were serious about? Well, the answer is yes, actually, they could be, because they're idiots, because they are capable of, they are in cognitive dissonance. Correct. They do not think correctly at the same time. Here, my advantage, I think, on all of you guys is I've met so many of these people face to face. And you keep thinking you're going to come up against a Kissinger, who certainly is a frighteningly brilliant, extraordinary man, and also with a great sense of humor. Well, Stalin had one too. But this is not Stalin. This is not Kissinger. These people are clowns.
Correct.
And that exactly, and that's the most terrifying aspect of it all. So there is this dissonance there. Everything you say is true, Alex, including the wish to, I think, to distract with other wars and other enemies. And they're playing this double game with the Chinese. They think they are, but the Chinese see through it, or they see a third level to it, so it backfires on them. When Janet Yellen and our Secretary of State, who are both morons, go to China and say, we are insulting you, we are demonizing you, Chinese citizens are being killed in hate crimes as a result of our policies across the United States, we are trying to ruin the Chinese economy, but we don't really mean any of it. They don't believe them, because they don't believe the words, they look at the actions. And you see the same thing with Chamberlain. They had endless discussions on what they needed to make an agreement with Russia. And many things got in the way, good and bad. But the bottom one always was the Russians insist on transit of their troops through Poland, and the Poles will not let them do it. Now, for anyone, as we all know, but you especially, Alex, and I, of course, because of our, you from the roots of Europe and me from covering it for so many years, we both know that Polish-Russian ethnic hatreds are remain to this day among the most intense on the planet. And therefore, the British government hemmed and hawed on this. Oh, Stalin's army isn't worth anything anyway, and they are after all communists. And even though Colonel Beck is a bit unpleasant, and of course he was a totally racist dictator himself, right? The Poland well, the aggressions of Poland over 20 years are another story for another time. They treated the Ukrainian people worse than even they treated the Jewish people, which was saying something. But they flatly said, we refuse to let, even though Britain and France knew they could not survive with their enormous empires unless they had Stalin on their side, they let Poland say to them, we refuse to let you make a military deal with Stalin. And they were so stupid that they let this work. This is the level of stupidity we see here again today. It is terrifying, and it is, unfortunately, I wish I could disagree, Alex, with any of you, with parts of your analysis. I would sleep better if I thought, oh, Alex was right here, but he was wrong here. There is still hope. No, there is no hope in your analysis, and your analysis is completely correct. And for the public record, I endorse it. I have to endorse it because you are warning the world. And I think it's our duty to support you on this. And all I can add is the picture is even worse because these policies are being carried out exactly as you say for the reasons that you say, but they cannot even present them properly because they themselves are idiots and they have alienated the Chinese for life. And if they were to actually act towards Russia, act towards China and say, we actually mean to look, we don't want war with Russia and we'll prove it. We'll work we should have implemented the Minsk agreements 9 years ago. Even if you can't agree them on those terms, we'll stop our flow of arms to Ukraine. Zelensky would stop in 5 seconds killing his own boys on those front lines if the United States told him to. There's no place for him to go. Instead, they still let the tail wag the dog, just as the British did in 1939. But the problem then, it's much bigger than then, because Britain was ultimately rescued by President Roosevelt and the United States. There is no one to rescue the United States today from these people.
The most dangerous thing with a lot of these Western morons that we always have to remember, Marty, you've encountered these idiots. I've done some think tank work back in the early aughts with a prominent think tank.
I know exactly.
There's an idiot with a man bun running around claiming to be an expert. You know the outfit I'm talking about. I am astounded by how stupid these morons are. I am astounded by the fact that they have created in the last several decades massive amounts of echo chambers that they call themselves think tanks. These are just echo chambers. Yes. They literally believe their own bullshit. And that's what makes it so dangerous. They think they're playing a multi-level chess game, that they are managing every facet of it, and they're not. And the Chinese and the Russians and many countries are waking up to the fact that these guys are idiots. They are blithering noisemakers, and their things are being ignored. And they got away with all of it. How did they get away with it? Because their financial system ran and dictated the world for so long. America's it's been said America's a rentier economy. It's a rent-seeking economy. In other words, we've been living off the rent check that the dollar has been paying us as world reserve currency. And if you look at American investors, like look at the American investor class, oh my God, what do they have? I could talk to, and I got clients of mine that are billionaires, millionaires and whatnot. The ones in the West, they all have investment portfolios. My clients that are outside of the U.S., they actually own companies and industry. The ones in the U.S. have paper. Yes. This is the reality, the paper reality that the West has been living off of, like a drug, like a hallucination, is finally starting to wear off, and the rest of the world is waking up to it. The narrative is failing colossally, gentlemen.
I would like to follow up on some points that both Martin and Alex had just made, if I may, just like with regard to the question of like, where would the U.S. maybe go next? And fully agreeing with the idea in this Orwellian sense that the illusion of war, or in the Baudrillardian sense, the hyper-reality of war can take the place of an actual war. But at the same time, there's always this desire to put like 2,000 or 3,000 troops somewhere. And I would suggest that they're looking at northern Mexico for that right now. Another thing to consider, and maybe just a devil's advocate or something to entertain, if you would, that in terms of the posture of the United States and what it's projecting with its low morale military, with military leaders that don't look like the role, they don't seem fit for purpose. And I think that the hypothesis that certainly at what we experience as the decision-making level, as Martin rightfully said, so many of these people are just blithering idiots. And yet at the same time, as Martin said, you've got people like Kissinger, Brzezinski, and others that are actually some kind of brains in this operation as well. And they are quite brilliant. So maybe I would suggest that if they are involved in any of this posturing, as Alex has suggested, of appearing to look like saying to the world, like, we don't want a war, from a perspective of and following up on the idea that you have the elites, the Western elites, their power in the world is shrinking. So this creates, like, they turn the screws on their own population, as Alex is saying. It's, austerity. As the empire collapses abroad, austerity increases at home. That's a very well-known formula. So, and following on that, then you're looking at instability situations. So when you look at institutions in a society that might fill in a power vacuum, when you have this elite system that is shaken or disturbed greatly, well, then now you're looking at what are the alternatives? Well, in the United States, they've already successfully destroyed, for example, the threat of, let's say, organized labor, right? Then when you have like a citizen voting populist movement, like on the Republican side around, let's say, Trump or something like this, then they're pushing the censorship, and as Alex and Martin were talking about very eloquently and better than I could put it, tightening those screws down on that end, right? So then you have, what are the other institutions? Well, if you have a strong military where the military institutions are respected, where the morale or belief in the institution is high, where having where the military is promoting based upon merit and based upon ability, as opposed to this idiotic regurgitation, as Martin so pointed out, and this mimicry and just copy paste kind of talking points and copy paste thoughts. So maybe the defanging of the military is about reducing threat for domestic issues, because without, let's say, a population that can rise up, and I'm not so certain that the verdict is out on that, but I would say that certainly they have taken the military and turned it into like a McDonald's type of job, and it really doesn't have a lot more. It doesn't have the associations that it used to have. So conclusively, I would look at that from like almost a counterinsurgency perspective, and that they're defanging, or that they want to lower morale in the military and drive people away who are competent. I think that's what Alex is pointing out when he talks about people turning down admiral promotions, because these are people that are saying, I don't have confidence in this lacking merit or lacking vision or lacking credibility organization. And I think that's significant and can't be overlooked or understated. So as an aside and a question mark, I would like to see like a 3-year or 5-year up to current, just in general, just to kind of get a trend idea of US-Russia trade and EU-Russia trade. And I would like to see like who's hurting more right now, connected to that and independently from that. And whether or not like Europe is like somehow, the low-hanging fruit. I balance of my time to anyone else.
Matthew. Matt, you're muted.
Mute.
My internet has been just god awful, and I do apologize for that.
Bad, Matt. This is bad. First, you're drinking hot water. Now the internet's bad. What's going on in Canada, bro?
Yeah, I think bad Canada. And I know my mic is not so great on my phone, so I do apologize if my voice cuts out. No, I mean, Joaquin brought up a lot of very interesting points. I mean, every speaker so far has brought a lot to the table to chew on and to think about. I found there's a lot of anomalies, and that's what was food for the mind, is the anomalies. What doesn't fit according to a popular explanation for something. One thing, is that Mexico did just celebrate their Independence Day last week. And in the military parade, it was noted that there was a Chinese military unit invited to march with the Mexican army, which was I found that a very interesting point. And the Russians.
Yes,
Wow.
yes, the Preobrazhensky Brigade was present. Yeah.
Yeah, so of course the both the right and the so-called lefts inside of the Congress, those who are picking up on that or who are reading Epoch Times, were flipping out that this is a part of the obvious plan for an invasion of the United States by Mexico as a proxy for the Ruskies and the commie Chinese, which is, there's a lot going on behind the surface. And we sort of get the cracks of it after decisions have been made. And then we have to sort of reverse engineer what the hell is going on. But I mean, obviously, Obrador is somebody who I generally think that he is his heart's on the right side of history, but he's operating in a den of vipers in a structure which has been very much under foreign influence for decades, especially since Portillo stood up against the vulture funds and the imperialists back in the early 80s and called for a debt moratorium and an industrial renaissance for Latin America. And Mexico was really punished heavily through speculative attacks and everything else for the next 30 plus years against the peso and the Mexican people. But despite that, there is this tradition, and I'm sort of saying this partially because Marty is going to be giving a class to the Rise and Tide Foundation this Sunday on the Anglo-French destruction of Mexico going back to the 19th century. So if anybody wants to check that out, I'm curious to see what he's going to have to say. But the spirit of Benito Juarez, who was somebody who was very much cut from the same cloth as Abraham Lincoln, has still remained alive despite all of the suppression and attacks that Mexico has suffered over the century. So there's something there that Obrador, he definitely had a very positive relationship with Trump. There were programs that involved creating sort of a New Deal with Trump offering to organize. He organized something in 2019, 2020 for a Marshall Plan for southern Mexico that would have involved building high-speed rail, electrification that also would have benefited other neighboring countries to Mexico's south. That all got put into the trash bin the second the current regime came into power in Washington. So I think that between Portillo's attacks against the Monroe Doctrine in its worst forms, being brought back online, that calls for taking the worst elements of Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy in the form of a new version of United Fruit Companies, like raping and pillaging Latin America. That's something that Obrador has spoken very, very eloquently and repeatedly against. And I think he's been trying to situate Mexico in a position where it could break free from the NSSM 200 policy of Kissinger that specifically targeted Mexico back in the 70s.
That's right.
A country that has to now be submissive to depopulation as the new foreign policy agenda for the United States that Kissinger outlined it at blood curdling.
Yes, it curdles the blood. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a writer. Right? So this is, Kissinger called literally for the full Club of Rome package, and he was working very closely. We talked at the beginning of this broadcast, so it's worth repeating it. He was working very closely with leading figures like Alexander King, like Aurelio Pitchet, like David Rockefeller from the Neo-Malthusian agenda, and David Rockefeller was the person who was overseeing the bankrolling of the Club of Rome from one of his estates in 1968. And this was brought into the World Economic Forum in their 1973 summit that brought Aurelio Pitchet to present his Club of Rome computer computer models for managing and foreseeing the future through this new type of advanced, swanky computer linear extrapolation technology that could think so much better than humans could about the future by just plugging in these very selected data sets and chosen variables that were then extrapolated into some imaginary future crisis point around.
Well, that reminds me a lot of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing, right? And it's the same thing for the longer green eco crisis that these guys brought online of man-made global warming. It all involves taking select data sets, whether it's CO2 that you tie to temperature or whether it's something, and I know this is streaming to YouTube, so we can't say certain things, but certain select data sets that could invoke fear in people that could be used in regards to an imaginary thing floating around that we should be afraid of that would justify then actions from governments that would conveniently have the effect of increasing tyranny and reducing the population of the earth through a variety of techniques. So it's all about the effects. That's always been the desire. So Mexico has been subjected to this policy of Kissinger and the Club of Rome for a long time. So there are 15 other countries that Kissinger laid out in his NSSM 200 report. And although China was not listed directly as one of those 15 countries, Ethiopia was, Egypt was, that at the time wished to go with the Japanese model of industrial development. That was the big thing at the time. How could we, as as abused nations, leap into the modern age by using what works of the U.S. experience, of the Japanese experience? How could we do that ourselves? And people like Bobby Kennedy, when you read his campaign platforms in 1967, 68, that's what he was going to assist with, just like his brother was doing earlier in 1962, 63. And that had to be stopped. And people like John Diefenbaker in Canada, the prime minister who was ousted in a Rhodes Scholar-run coup the same year that JFK was killed in the U.S., he was also for helping these former colonies of the British Empire access high-quality technology, nuclear power, make sure that the money that we give would not just be sent towards IMF conditionalities and structural readjustments of their economies, but rather, or appropriate technologies, which was the name given to the Kissinger approved form of lending in the 70s, and Maurice Strong. But these real nation builders who were ousted in the 60s wished they understood that this money had to go towards large scale mega projects, industrial development, and that had to be ended. So Mexico's been trying to get back to revive. I mean, there's been an effort, mostly it's been in the back doors that people haven't really been seeing too much of this, but now it's burst onto the scene increasingly. And I think that, again, Mexico is positioning themselves to be in a situation where they will be partners with this multipolar alliance of pro-economic, pro-industrial development as the current type system continues to sink, and that's dominated by Wall Street and London. But we'll see where it goes.
Very well said.
Hear, hear.
I guess as we're coming to the end of the program, Joaquin, Alex, Krainer, Martin, anything you guys want to add?
Yes, I just like this situation with the United States and its pushes against. I mean, I guess we're streaming, but people do say Russia now, don't they? On YouTube, you can say Russia now on YouTube. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I was going to say, the country east of Poland, but you have in the country east of Poland. Well, this crisis, Poland is doing something right now with its relationship with Ukraine. And it is looking like they are doing something, and they're making it look very heavily like the relationship is souring. And others have pointed out that, well, this is merely just an election stunt in Poland because there's enough sentiment in Polish society that's actually not happy with all of the whatever that Poland has done for Ukraine, which is a very big question mark, for me about then what, because the presumptions, the built-in presumptions into this, I would say, explaining away of this rift between Poland and Ukraine as being merely an election stunt, begs the question of why so many Polish voters are opposed to this ongoing support for Ukraine, and so it's that part of the question is kind of left unaddressed in this theory. So I'm entertaining that theory, but at the same time, what about just they are having problems with Ukraine because Ukraine is losing, and while victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is but a bastard. And they would like to, extricate themselves remove themselves, do like a Trudeau and let the fecal matter, run downhill. And I'm convinced almost that we have to entertain that Poland may actually be trying and could be engaging in backdoor diplomacy with the Russians even. And certainly it has been said outright by Ukrainians who don't have a lot of credibility on this subject, but a broken clock once in a while, at least twice a day, will give you the right time. And I think maybe there's something to this.
It's very possible.
Definitely, the Poles are very unimpressed by the blatant Nazism, which everyone kind of knew it, but you weren't supposed to put it that up front.
Exactly.
I mean, in Canada, we just had the whole Canadian Parliament do a crazy salute and applause in honor of this SS Galicia division.
I mean, you're right there on the ground. You're in Canada. What's the buzz? Like, what's going on with this?
Oh, it's a total disaster. It's the Speaker of the House just resigned.
Good.
Is that official?
Yeah, it's official. He was thrown under the bus. I mean, somebody had to take the blame.
Not Trudeau.
Trudeau, no. I mean, and everyone's probably had a chance to see Trudeau's so-called weak apology, saying what an embarrassment this is, but he still somehow found a way to twist it to blame it all on Russian propaganda.
Oh my God.
But yeah, this is like, it's a total train wreck of a disaster, and it's a good train wreck. It's a useful one, and the Polish ambassador's freaked out about this demand. I mean, I think the loudest of all the ambassadors is the Polish. I mean, and despite that, Canada's come out. We put $9 billion towards the Ukraine meat grinder, and we're inviting more money printing towards that disaster, despite all the evidence that's showing that this is going nowhere. It's going in reverse. And even the Poles, who were like the biggest cheerleaders not that long ago, are also saying like that Ukraine is a drowning man, and we're not going to help.
They used those words. In fact, that was the words that they used. That Ukraine's a drowning man.
Yeah.
Right. I was thinking to myself that this whole entire Galician Nazi SS, Waffen SS member, that the salute and praise and adulations that were poured upon him, I don't think that was an accident. I think he was put there on purpose. What do you guys think? Because you got to understand, like in Western Ukraine, you got the Banderistas that are salivating on getting a piece of Poland. And now you have a Polish-Ukrainian rift going on. Look, there's no honor among thieves. I don't expect the U.S. to foment something between Poland and you. It's possible. Who knows? Chaos.
No, it's all that's a very well conceived possibility.
Interesting.
Alex Krainer, what do you think?
Well, okay. So with regards to the standing ovation to the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, of course, there's no chance that was a mistake.
Yeah,
that may have been a mistake by some of the people who were applauding there, who didn't really know why they were applauding. But whoever organized that knew exactly what they were doing. They knew exactly what there's no. This is Canadian Parliament, right? This is not like a pub around the corner where people just do shit and say stuff. It's like, the list of attendees and guests for sure has been. They sent a car for this man. They knew who they were bringing there. And then when you include in your speech that this hero was fighting against Russia, how can you not work out that he was on the wrong side of history, that man? So they played it, and then now they're doing the typical, oh, we made mistakes, lessons learned, we have to move forward, not backward, let's not play political games, let's not point fingers, always the same thing. But I have to say that in spite of the fact that in the discussion we had before, which would imply that things are really bad and that we should be maybe pessimistic, we have to always remember that, we've never been at this point in history before. We've never had internet. We've never had conversations like this. I lived through the outbreak of war in the former Yugoslavia, and back then, this was the early 1990s. We didn't have the internet. We really did depend on newspapers and radio and television for information. That's not longer the case. And so, there's several things that I've observed over the war in Ukraine, which was, one of the two absolutely major projects for the globalists in the last 4 years. The first one was the pandemic, and the second one was the breakup of Russia. And as soon as they managed to coax Russia into invading Ukraine, which they set up as a trap, they immediately instituted a very draconian regime of censorship. They cut off all the Russian sources, RT, Sputnik.
Exactly.
All the voices from Russia were forced out of the scene. They started, they escalated even the Russophobic narratives. We had in theaters, we had recitals of Russian composers canceled in Italy, and some universities canceled their classes on Russian literature. We were, they really intended for us to hate Russia, to close ranks and be ready for a major war. They really wanted a world war between two, monolithic blocks, all of society conflict. Didn't work out that way at all. And I remember within the first 2 weeks of the war, they ran a poll in France asking public opinion how they perceive the conflict. And 57% of the French people, ordinary French people that they asked, and this is an official French poll by IPOF, Institute for the Research of Public Opinion. 57% of ordinary French people believed Russian justifications for war. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that was within 2 weeks. I have a friend who works for NATO in one of the countries in the Balkans, and she told me that that NATO is monitoring public mood in among NATO member nations very closely, for the very obvious reason, like they're eager to to find cohesion among the population, willingness to go to war, and they're not finding it. So in the nations of Eastern Europe, and I'm talking about March of this year, so like about 6 months ago, it was about 3 out of 4 people who sympathize with the Russian side. NATO's own polling. This is not public. This I know from a person who told me, who works on these things. And among the nations like France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, it's about 2 out of 3.
Wow.
So 2 out of 3 people sympathize with the Russian side. And then I myself came across a number of unofficial online polls on Twitter and on YouTube. And I looked at the polls that had, responses in the tens of thousands of people, and, accounts that were not obviously pro-Russian, right? And the responses that were favorable to Russia were between 70 and 80%. So one of the questions was, who's responsible for the war in Ukraine? Russia, West. 80% of the people said West. And then there was a question like, if you had to choose between Putin and Zelensky, who would you choose? I think it was 75% of people, Putin. And, several. So anyway, long story short, they didn't get what they wanted. They weren't able to engineer the consent for World War III against Russia. Yeah. It all kind of dissipated on them, and they can't seem to get the real deal going. And the proxy thing that they have going, they're losing it, right? And so I'm very optimistic, because even though at the level of the official institutions, things are absolutely dismal, and at the level of corporate mainstream media, things are dismal. Yeah. There's a new element in this social and political equation, and that is the people, the ordinary people. And I think that this is where they were unprepared. They didn't count with this, or they didn't foresee that the reactions would be completely unpredictable, and that they could not control them. And so now they're in a panic. They want to censor. They need to attribute everything to Russia's malign influence and propaganda and all this. But these are all the reaction after the horses have bolted from the barn. Yeah. It's too late. They lost. So now I think that we have to realize that we are winning, but we have to also realize that we haven't won.
Yes.
We have to keep pressing.
Right.
And we have to, I think, actively think about what it is that we want to replace the current order, because the current order is fraudulent. It's pathogenic. It's probably the worst thing that humanity has gone through since the days of the Roman Empire. And obviously we need something better going forward. And I think that from where we are, it shouldn't be difficult to improve, but nevertheless, we can't allow ourselves to be misled into another iteration, into another reincarnation of the same old that's been, perpetuating itself in various forms since for the last 2,000 years. Yeah. So we need to fix the money. We need to engineer certain incentives out of the society that are leading to the emergence of oligarchies, which then become dominant in societies, and which then lead the development, the social, economic, political development. So we have the opportunities to do all those things. We just have to really, really look into the building blocks of modern societies, and make sure that they're built so that we get what we want out of life, and not what the higher ups, the degenerates that are ruling the world at the moment, think up for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, because obviously the current system is collapsing. It will collapse. There's no avoiding the inevitability of the collapse of this current system, because it was made to collapse. It was made to become a bubble, which would be triggered, as all bubbles can be triggered at some expedient time, for a collapse. And as much as you can sort of kick the can down the road, add another QE operation or some other thing to sort of stretch it a little bit longer, there's only so much stretching that can happen when your food process, the means of production are breaking down, the means of supporting ultimately there is a physical reality that justifies the existence of the money, the debt, the derivatives, other things you build onto the system. So it's going to collapse.
Yep.
And will we get a system which is even worse, equal to or worse than the logic of oligarchism that brought us to this current collapse? Or are we going to get something much more in harmony with what humans actually need and require and should want if we're mature? And that's the problem, I think, with human beings. Not the problem, the beautiful thing, the problem, whatever you want to call it, is that we have free will and we could choose. Unlike animals, you know, like bees know that they need pollen, they need bee things, and that makes the bee happy. And plants, they need the sunlight, they want that. They want the sunlight, the water, and they will grow, you know, they will do what plants do. And that's all good, but they don't have will. They can't choose to, you know, wake up and say, I identify with being a cat today, says the bee, or they can't choose to try to be what they aren't. Whereas human beings, because we have free will, we're a species of ideas that shape our identity of ourselves, our internal universe, and what we think of as the external universe that we're trying to make sense of. So we can freely choose to be stupid. And we could choose to I could maybe want heroin instead of water. You know, a lot of people do. Go to East Hastings in Vancouver. A lot of people there are in a wretched, terrible situation because they're addicted to fentanyl. That's like every drug is now legal in British Columbia. They want to do this all across Canada now. And it's like a dark age zone of you don't want to get out of your car driving through these zones, you know? And these are people who would, if you were going to create a census or a survey, they would mostly select more fentanyl or heroin instead of water or food. So the thing of like what makes a human being a mature, integrated human being is do we have the emotional development which is grown with our intellectual development and our body, right? Because our body's going to grow like no matter what. But do the emotional state and the mental state also grow in tandem, or do you have like people walking around as, you know, driving around with trophy wives, you know, in their 60s, in a midlife crisis because they have an infantile ego and they're always
Right.
chase some potion of rejuvenation without accepting the fact that no, human beings, you're getting old, right? Like we all have this path to go through, and I think that's part of the consumer society, right? So we're living in a world which has been now several generations in by this social engineering experiment that really went hard on the baby boomers, that flooded that whole generation with psychedelic drugs, nihilism, nihilistic literature into the universities, you know, Frankfurt School wokest educational reforms into the universities that really got underway even afterwards. But the drugs were big. And they didn't know what the world was that was going to shit all around them, and their friends were coming back in body bags from Vietnam. And why were we in Vietnam? And why were my leaders who were heroes getting killed? You don't know. And so the young people were jumping into escapism, and you know the CIA and MK Ultra were more than happy to provide abundant drugs for all of these young people going into this you know, create my own fantasy land. Reality is too scary, so I'm going to just make my own reality, says Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley. And doors of perception, you know, I'll create more psychedelic doors to appreciate that fake reality I want to manufacture. And these then became the leaders of corporations and governments in the transatlantic zone in the 80s and the 90s. And you're wondering, like, how did our society make so many stupid decisions on everything, which has only made life worse for everybody? And you can't answer that question if you don't look at culturally how the understanding of what we want and what we need was so that it was made ambiguous. So people wanted things they didn't need. And I think if you just look today, well, let's say we have 8 billion people. I don't know. Let's say it's that number. There's certain objective criteria to what is needed for all of those 8 billion people to live dignified lives. There's a physical, you need water, you need food, you need some inspiration, job opportunities. You need these things. This is what Franklin Roosevelt laid out as his 4 freedoms that he saw as being the manifestation of the ideals of the American Revolution for all of humanity. And the 4 freedoms, you know, the freedom from want, the freedom from fear of secret police, the freedom of conscience to worship as you see fit. I forget the last one. That was something which was supposed to not just be nice words to get elected, but rather like an active organizing force of the UN Charter, of the basis upon which the IMF, the World Bank, and other Bretton Woods institutions were supposed to be like operating under. But we all know that didn't go very long. The death cultists took over his dead body. All of the people who thought in those terms that he was thinking were called red commie traitors and destroyed. Some were killed, like, you know, and some were just had their careers annihilated. JFK tried to revive this in his own time, this principle of an international New Deal. And I think we see that Russia, China, the multipolar alliance with the Belt and Road Initiative, in my assessment of history, this has picked up the torch that was left by Franklin Roosevelt for internationalizing this idea that economics should be based upon benefiting all participants instead of just a few trying to manage the scarcity in a world of diminishing returns, and creating abundance instead of scarcity. So I'll just end my remarks and then I got to go with Sergei Lavrov. He made a really good speech not that long ago, a year ago, saying what will be the identity for the Russians going forward. And he's like, there's a lack of cohesive identity, you know, and he's making the point China has a 5,000-year-old identity. They've got Confucianism. There's a certain lack still of like what will be the identity for Russians. And he said like the best thing would be to organize it around problem solving and leaping outside of the limits to growth. And he was very clear in this beautiful speech that should be the key driving force of our identity, is we are the people who leap outside of the limits to growth and make discoveries. That should be what we focus on. And I think that way of thinking applies to every culture, regardless of whatever religion you're from or whatever. That's a universal, and you will value the right things, right? We will value building infrastructure instead of building casinos. We will value all the good things that we should value if we have that core identity we strive for. So I hope that's the case.
No, it's great, but the thing is that us Americans have the Russians beat when it comes to identity, because we have multiple identities. Every day we're inventing new genders. We have creative ways of different types of sodomy. I mean, it's amazing what we offer the world. It really is. Martin, 30 seconds, last comments. I'm going to give everybody 30 seconds. So Martin, we'll start with you, 30 seconds. We're trying to corral you as best as we can with 30 seconds. You're like this incredible dynamic.
I would a point from me is I don't think there is a plot in the Biden administration or the top levels of the military to destroy the credibility of the U.S. armed forces. They are doing that, absolutely. Yeah. And they actually are so benighted and crazed, they think they are improving the credibility of the armed forces. Mm-hmm. This comes back to a key point Matt always says about the establishment of the new universalist religion. The new universalist religion is minimum destruction of free speech, oppression, of course, but also total free trade, total freedom of movement, so that slave laborers and human trafficking and drug trafficking can go unimpeded everywhere. And this will bring automatic human happiness. Cordell Hull believed in the gospel of free trade way back in the 1930s. FDR was Secretary of State for 12 years. FDR didn't let him go too far with it, but it was ensconced in the belief systems of everyone who had followed Woodrow Wilson. But another key element here is these idiots really believe that if you open the military to the talents of transgenders, as well as people coming in from all over the world who are not culturally or politically or spiritually acclimatized to being Americans, you will bring in talent rather than instability and discord. They are destroying the American armed forces exactly as you guys have said and as Alex said, but they really believe they are not. And they cannot believe there is an alternative way in the world. And they cannot let the Russians or the Chinese or Viktor Orban or any country, they reject Sam Huntington. They reject the plurality of civilizations. And this is at the bottom of everything. Not only do they have this insane system which has collapsed and is totally unsustainable in the United States and Europe, but they will not rest until they have imposed it on everyone else. And this is what makes world war inevitable.
Very well said. Alex Krainer, go for it.
Okay, well, I I really hope that Martin is wrong,
So do I.
and I hope that the world war is evitable. Is that a word? I don't think it is.
We'll make
Inevitable.
it one.
I think that it's avoidable. I think that in addition to the Western public having been sufficiently politically awakened that they're no longer as easy to manipulate and deceive into another world war, we have also extraordinarily sophisticated adversaries in the Russian and Chinese leadership that are systematically pulling the support from under these Western oligarchs. And it seems to me that they know exactly what they're doing. They're repeatedly declining to fall into cheap provocations. They are repeatedly managing to maneuver around major unpredictable escalations, and they are building bridges with key partners and allies around the world. Like, for example, take the example of Turkey. Britain was working on a grand coalition of Great Britain, Poland, Ukraine, and Turkey in a kind of Crimea War 2.0 agenda, and it fell apart. Why? The Russians were skillfully managing their relationship with Turkey, and Turkey simply didn't take part of that alliance. And so, militarily, they are a worthy adversary. In terms of arsenal and armament, I think that Russians are now ahead of the West. In terms of skill, they're also ahead of the West. They just got 18 months worth of intense training. They saw how the West wages war. They have tightened their processes and their training and their logistics and everything. They have improved over the last 18 months. And I think there's no taste for war in the West. I think that even if somebody launched a nuclear weapon, I don't think it's 100% certainty that it would instantly escalate all the way. And then if it did, the Western oligarchies would be instantly incinerated. That would be the end of them. So I'm optimistic. I hope it can be. I hope the World War III is evitable.
Yeah, I agree with you, Alex. I'll tell you right now, a quick little snippet. I've said this story multiple times. One of the clients I've had, he was in the nuclear forces in the United States, and then when he retired out of the nuclear forces, he went to work within the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So he was the top guy keeping the nuclear power plants, the few remaining nuclear power plants in the United States, from going into meltdown, right? And he came up with the term that the way the nuclear power plants are run in the United States is a term that he coined as known as run to failure. Run to failure. There's no way, our plants are in dilapidated shape. But one of the points he made about our nuclear arsenal, right? I mean, the latest nuclear missile that the United States has, the Trident III, right? Or the Minuteman II, right? That was created in 1973. Our nuclear forces are so dilapidated.
Yes.
One of the things that he's told me, he would be surprised that if even 20% of them are fieldable, and that's a high number, if even 20% of them are fieldable. So we might have 4,798 nukes, but only a fraction of them could be even fieldable. A lot of the ICBM batteries are in such a state of disrepair and low maintenance. The guys who are trained to maintain these ICBMs, they're either retired or gone, and they don't have the sufficient talent to maintain it. So if Russia were to launch off a couple of hypersonic Sarmat 2s in the United States, there's no response. That's the scary thing. There's some brilliant minds in the Pentagon that know this. They know where the limits are. But the deranged nut jobs, these neocons who live in these echo chambers thinking that we're the greatest economy in the world, we're the most powerful military, those guys are clueless, and that's what we have the stupid idiots in charge. Joaquin, go for it, brother.
Your description of the nuclear program sounds a lot like NASA's moon program. Very strange. I won't comment further. I'm following up on, before we started our summaries, the last kind of conversation, but in my 30 seconds, I would say that they can't quantitative easing move forever. Of course. So then what? And how does that look like? So it's like default, right? Debt restructuring, default. What are the themes I'm looking at? Oversaturation, but also, we think about labor-saving technologies applied. So you're looking really at a crisis of overproduction. If you need to produce things that are profitable, who's making them? Not people. Who's your consumers? People. So they have to buy it at some price. Without labor, though, that price is very low, but that doesn't work out for oligarchies. So we have a fundamental disagreement here. I'm looking at issues like the, law of diminishing returns, declining rate of profit, things like that, and driving these crises, investment into the means of destruction, expending through these old stockpiles, trying to get military spending going in some way. I don't think they really know. I think that I think Martin makes a very compelling case about some of the blindness and stupidity which is driving some of these inherited policies, and then everyone's kind of winging it based upon stupid policies that they've inherited. So even intelligent people trying to come into the situation are going to have to sort through so much administrative or inherited crap that Martin makes a very good case. At the same time, I have to say, I hope he's wrong. But not in contrast to this, but as Matt is saying, and as Alex is saying, this is fundamentally about the real miscalculation is about underestimating people power, the power of pluralism in the real sense, not this hyper reality of pluralism, not all of these fake endowments and philanthropists, but real pluralism, which what we're doing right here in this forum, real civil society. And I think that, as Alex inferred greatly or said outright, that the internet in many ways drove this. And he referenced his experience in wartime Yugoslavia with the limited news sources and how that drove people, and I will add, probably into more of an internecine conflict than was necessary. So I'm optimistic.
You're muted, V.
Oh God, I did it again. Martin's wearing off on me. I'm muting myself more often these days.
I wasn't the only one doing it this time.
I want to thank all you guys for doing this roundtable, and especially the way that things are going in this world. Love to have you guys on more frequently, at least once or twice a month, just doing a roundtable just to catch up. Audience loves it, and I'll have all your websites and everything in the description box so people could follow you. Folks, thank you all for listening in, and have a wonderful day. Again, re-listen to this broadcast, share it with your friends and family, let the word get out there. And thank you so much for joining in. Thank you all for listening. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.